real life event. Gotta click that button. I guess I'll just say welcome again and thank you, Trees New York. It's wonderful to be here celebrating my book, The Language of Trees. And this is actually the first virtual event that I'm doing on the book tour. The book was published on April 4th, so it's been, I don't know, 3 weeks or so. And it's been an incredible, beautiful whirlwind touring across the country. I'm currently in Atlanta, Georgia, in a beautiful tree house. I hope you can hear me okay. There's a little stream right underneath my treehouse, but hopefully the sound is okay and the stream is not interfering too much with the sound quality. So I have some images. I'm a visual artist, so hopefully the images will move. Here we go. So this is The Language of Trees. This is it. I took off the dust jacket just because I like this version with my forest drawing on the cover. And the book's going to come out in June. The image that's on the right-hand side is the cover of the UK Irish edition, and that's what I'm working on right now in between actual events for the book. So it's really I guess a love letter, essentially. I wrote an afterword that's in the back of the book, and I describe it as a love letter. I mentioned that I'm a visual artist. I'm not technically a writer, although I have been using language a lot in my work. And nature and the environment, that's the kind of person I am. It's how I've always understood the world. I grew up in rural Ireland. This is an image of the bog. One of the earliest works in the projects that I did was working with the bog in RD, where I grew up, where I was living when I was younger, and where my mum still lives. And it's very much a part of me and my heart. And you might think, okay, what's a bog got to do with trees? Well, bogs are peatlands, and they're formed when, over 10,000 years. So it's slow time, kind of like trees. They exist in tree time. It's also when the trees that were there, lots of oaks, and they would have fallen and decomposed. And with the lack of oxygen, they formed peat. And for me, it was these artworks, the first projects that I ever made, I guess, officially as an artist. Although we all start making work, I think, as soon as we're, when we're really little. But these works, it was my way of really being in a place and studying it and looking at it. I mightn't have realized it at the time, but it was just being outside, lying down on the ground, looking really close. So I took a series of photos looking up close at plants like the sundew, which is carnivorous, and it catches like a little Venus flytrap. And people have no idea. A lot of people don't realize that we have incredible plants like this in Ireland. And they're right there under our feet. So it's about getting close up and looking and seeing what's there. And I think with Trees New York and citizen pruners, people, that's kind of part of what your people on this Zoom will be people who do stop and pause and maybe notice and hear the birds and see the trees or the insects. So maybe I'm speaking to the choir here, but you'll get to see how that work, taking photographs, but also drawings, has come together over decades. So that was in the 90s to make a book that really just took 1 year. So some people think the whole book was made, The Language of Trees was made in 1 year, but it's really a compilation that took many, many, many years, 20 years or more. So I made works like this, which it was crocheted, so it was made with yarn, like a drawing that was made while I traveled. So it was like my carbon footprint. Each of those pieces was made while I was traveling to the venue, the gallery in Dublin. And I realized I called it 137.5 degrees because as I was crocheting, just making the single stitch over and over and over again. A lot of my work is very simple. It's about using everyday materials that I have at hand. And this single stitch, when it's repeated, you can go off on lines and tangents, kind of the way plants, you've got a lot of trees behind me. You know how you've got the main stem and then you have the trees branch off. And in most flowering plants, that angle happens to be 137.5 degrees. So these patterns that repeat in nature have been something that's always fascinated me, maybe because my dad was a mathematician, worked with numbers, and he tried to instill that in me, a way of using a man-made language, mathematics, to read and understand and try and calculate how things work and relate to other things. Having said that, my mum was a gardener and is still a gardener and a flower flower arranger or floral artist working with plants. So those two things together, the organic and the man-made mathematical systems, have always kind of entwined in how I look and understand and try and read the world. And my fascination with trying to see how, me as one little individual in the middle of rural Ireland kind of can communicate or read the world around me. And I do that through drawings. So this is I make a lot of drawings, and they're often actually in books that look just like this. When I've been traveling across country, so I've been taking trains. I only took one flight. The rest of it was all slow travel. And people thought this was my journal, like it was full of blank pages that I was writing. But I have a lot of notebooks that do look just like this, full of my drawings and notes. And the drawings are often they could just be notes, lists of to-do things, but also reminders, memories. I made a lot of drawings of places I'd lived, trying to work with memory. It's interesting now, I got COVID exactly 1 year ago, and I tuned into Doug Tallamy's talk for Trees New York. And that was in the depths of my brain fog, COVID. I couldn't even lie up in bed, and I enjoyed his Zoom so much. So it's kind of an honor to be giving a Trees New York talk this year with my own book. But I remembered the beauty of the images that Doug shared, the birds, and the reason I mentioned the COVID that I had it. I'm living with long COVID. I have dysautonomia, so my autonomic system is broken, and so it affects my brain as well as my heart and my breathing. Everything is kind of broken. We're not quite sure what's happening exactly. Hopefully it'll fix itself. But the reason I mentioned it is I've always been interested in memory, and I've always been trying to slow down. And this was one reason I was working with trees, maybe plants, trying to think on plant time, or now I call it tree time. And so the drawings, so that was before I got COVID and living with it all. So it's interesting how maybe, not that I would wish COVID or any of this on anyone, but it is interesting how our bodies, we are natural ecosystems ourselves. Like the human body is made up of so many non-human beings. Like there are more non-human cells or inside of the human body, trillions of bacteria and whatnot. So what is an individual? What is a human? It's something I've always been really interested in. And I think starting off with a piece of paper and a pen, trying to write or draw. For me, I'm a drawer. I think we're all drawers. You just make a mark. And I moved to New York. A lot of this work, I have to admit, the language of trees, you could say that it comes out of the Fulbright scholarship that I did the reason I went to New York in the first place was 2004, so almost 20 years ago, to research our relationship with nature, this little word nature. And I'm still doing exactly the same work. I arrived, it was the beginning of college, so it would have been August. And I started responding to the street trees and making these series of drawings, just very simple pen and ink. And then I started constructing them. So this is one that I constructed out of recycled materials for the Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis. So it was like a way to turn my two-dimensional flat drawings into a three-dimensional object. Then years later, so time passes, and I'm making lots of other work in between. The way you do, you tend to work on many projects at the same time, and they all feed into each other. And then Nelson mentioned in his kind introduction that we met quite a while ago. It would have been, I think, when I was working on the Tree Museum, a public art project in the Bronx. So it was wonderful to hear that you've been planting trees up there. Part of my heart is still in the Bronx. I really loved going up there every day and meeting. I met hundreds, thousands of people maybe to create this tree museum, a public art project that was commissioned by the Bronx Museum that's on the Grand Concourse and the New York City Parks Department and Wave Hill. And those three institutions commissioned me to create a public art project to celebrate the centennial of the Grand Concourse, which is this huge thoroughfare, like the Park Avenue of the Bronx, 4.5 miles long. So what I ended up doing was realizing that the street trees, that I really wanted to look at the entire length of the street rather than create a sculpture and put it in one place. Like this is Joyce Kilmer Park on 161st Street. And I realized that on my walks and in the conversations, well, the conversations were just so inspiring. I didn't know anything about the Bronx when I started this. I was meeting all kinds of people, community gardeners, students, teachers, and it was the conversations, I guess, kind of, they grew into this, again, a love letter. I'm sorry to keep repeating it, but it really felt like there was so much love and community, and it needed to be shared. All of these stories really needed, other people needed to hear them, because I felt like I was being told all these precious, important, powerful messages of what people were doing at local level and community. And it was making me feel so good. And I thought, well, everybody is telling me how scary it is to go to the Bronx and how dangerous it is and how I should be really careful. And I said, why, if they heard all of these stories that I'm hearing, they'd fall in love with it the way I did. So I matched up the street trees. I realized these, the drawings that I was making were like portraits of the individual street trees. And I realized as I was walking on the concourse, the one thing that connected the entire 4.5 mile length of the street were the street trees. So I thought, okay, we can bring the trees, the street trees, and the people together. And that's really what the Tree Museum was all about. And I used an audio guide it was Jennifer McGregor, curator at Wave Hill, who had the knowledge. She'd been doing research into using audio guides like they use in museums, having it outside in the street. So I selected 100 trees along the length of the concourse. And all the people kind of I combined. So each tree had a different voice and person telling a story. So it was a way to invite anyone and everyone to be part of the Tree Museum. It was invisible. There were just signposts and maps and guidebooks that I made available. And then we did exciting things, because if you have a museum, right, obviously a tree museum, nobody knows what that is. What is a tree museum? It's different from an arboretum. It's different from a regular art museum. It can be anything you want it to be, which is one of the beautiful things about being an artist. You can kind of make it up as you go along and explore different areas and maybe bring people together who wouldn't normally get to be together. So I got to bring E.J. McAdams, who's a poet, had worked with the parks as a park ranger, and we went into classrooms and taught students about haikus. And then we took the students out of the classroom and went on haiku hikes. And I have to say, this was the most, I think the most exciting part of the Tree Museum maybe was to take students out of the classroom. And it was such a simple thing to do, to think about haikus, very short poems, which is about looking and listening. So where I am right now in this treehouse with the sound of the stream, I don't know if you can actually hear it, but for me, it's very loud. I feel like I'm shouting at you. I hope it doesn't come across like I'm shouting at you. And the trees squeak, you've got the birds, you have airplanes, there were leaf blowers earlier on, which is a whole other story. But for the students, for them to be outside in the real world, not in the classroom, and to stop and listen and learn. I could almost hear their brains twirling around inside their head. It was really beautiful, powerful moment. And it's these simple actions, I think, that mean so much to me, and I get so much out of, and I feel like more of this, play, learning through play. And I think trees have a really important place in all of our hearts. So one thing led to another, and years later, I realized that those tree drawings that I'd been making, the trees themselves could become characters, or they are characters. And so I made a tree drawing for each letter of the alphabet and worked with the designer so that we could turn my tree drawings into a font. So here you can see some of the A to Z. It's a font that you can download from my website. And I made a book called About Trees, which is really at the heart of this book, The Language of Trees. And I saw somebody in the chat, I think, mentioned About Trees. So if you've seen About Trees, you'll know what's going to happen in this book, The Language of Trees. At the heart of it is a tree alphabet, which is here. I share it at the beginning. Ross Gay very generously wrote the introduction to the book, and right after Ross's introduction is the tree alphabet with the A to Z. So it's like a key or a guide, and you can then translate everything into trees. And that's what I've done. I've translated everything in the book is translated into trees, letter by letter, tree by tree. And so for me, it was a way of distilling, I guess, a lot of these stories. It comes back to storytelling again, humans and trees together. I think we have a lot to learn from each other, maybe more humans have more to learn from them. So here you can see the drawing. So on the left would be the tree drawing, and on the right is the typeface. So when you download the font on your computer, when you type the apple tree pops up. So it's a way to slow down. Literally, your brain kind of slows down to try and think and translate. Wait a minute, what am I writing? What is that word? So like the word nature, which was what I had begun all of this work studying or looking at, looks differently when it's written with trees. And so the book is a collection of all kinds of things, really. It was a way, the book about trees, I didn't tell anyone at the time, but it was a way for me to celebrate my 40th birthday. And it was like a time capsule. I wanted to celebrate what it is to be a 40-year-old person on planet Earth, which means, because the tree museum I didn't really mention, but it was the 100-year anniversary of the Grand Concourse that we were celebrating, which meant going further back in time, because you can't think about 100 years without thinking of what came before. And then that means you also think about the future. What are we leaving or creating that's going to happen like 100 years in the future, and on and on and on. And so this looping of time is something that I'm very interested in. And I keep, I might mention tree time a lot. This is an essay by Robert Sullivan that's translated into trees. And then this is the tree school. So I mentioned learning through play and how we have a lot to learn from trees. This was a public art project in Dublin, in Ireland a few years ago with Shodine O'Sullivan, another Irish artist. We were invited to create something to celebrate James Joyce Street, which is actually a teeny tiny little kind of ugly leftover side street in the heart of Dublin city centre. And there's this park that's been very neglected. It's used a lot by druggies, as they're called in Ireland, with needles and everything hidden in the bushes. So we created a tree school as a way to invite everyone to just come together for conversation, chat, play, learning, education. So I think a lot of my work has been getting more and more interested in education, what it is to learn together. We've had a lot of little people, but learning doesn't just mean the little people, it's also what we're able to learn from them, and then what the older people also need to learn. For example, politicians, a lot of them are quite old. And so this loops back to the first image I shared from RD Bog. I co-founded a group in 2018 called Friends of RD Bog with my neighbours. We were all really very worried about what was happening with the Irish government. Here are some of the ministers pictured outside the Dáil, which is the Irish government offices in Dublin. And this was 2021 when I was finally able to get back to Ireland. I got stuck here in the US with the travel ban. But I started the group because the government wanted to build a road through the edge of the bog, which is a peatland, which is not a good idea for many, many, many reasons. It's similar to how communities are standing up to, trying to stand up to stop tree cutting that's happening, where cities and governments come in and say they're going to chop down, like for example, what's happening in East River Park, where they say it's a climate resiliency project, that they're going to do something, the city's going to do something great and try and save the city from climate change by removing a park and raising it up 8 feet. So it's completely ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense in so many ways. But it's the local community who has to state the obvious and stand up for these natural ecosystems, because they don't have a voice that we humans can hear. Maybe because we're too ignorant, or we just don't know how to listen on that frequency, because we're humans, so we're used to listening to each other. And I feel like I'm talking a lot, but hopefully it's not in a bad way. You'll all have questions for me later. But this powerful thing that happens when an individual comes together with another individual and you kind of form a group. So all of us, the members, what became Friends of RD Bog, we were all individuals, really, really sad, upset, heartbroken, angry, frustrated, confused about what was happening. There was no way to find information. All we knew is the government was going to build this road, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. They had received millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of euros to build the road, because that's the future. making Ireland, you know, this great first world country in 2023 where we build roads. So we came together and we said, no, you're not going to do it. It's a bog, it's precious, it stores more carbon than rainforests, it's habitat to curlews. I made the logo using the curlew, which is this beautiful bird with the long curved beak. It's on the brink of extinction in Ireland, as almost every species on this planet probably is at this point with what we humans have been doing. But they're literally on the brink of extinction. There are just 100 breeding pairs left. So within 4 years, there may be no more curlews. So anyway, I created a petition and over 10,000 people signed, which is quite an enormous number in Ireland. And we are taking them to court. So at the moment, that case is in the court in Ireland. And when I included this photo when I was climate striking with Greta Thunberg outside the UN, with other young students, because, you know, Friends of Ardee Bog is a lot of older people. My age, I'm 40 something now, 7, students, but it is the majority, most of us would be older people who've lived in the area for a long time. And then obviously you have this movement that Greta started that's kind of sparked the hearts of a lot of people and gave people a reason to see it's not hopeless. We can come together and we do have a voice. It's still obviously difficult. We still have a long ways to go. So entangled with all of these protests and all of that action, I'm still making drawings and still working on artworks. This was the New York City tree alphabet that I made with the Parks Department. So after I made the book about trees, actually, as soon as I held the book in my hand, I realized, oh, we could make a planting palette, work with trees, include all of the trees that are happy to a specific place. So with the, and I had worked with the Parks Department on the Tree Museum project. So Bram Gunther, who was the head of forestry, I can't remember his exact title. He's since retired, but he heard about my project, I guess through EJ McAdams, and we thought the parks were just starting an artist residency program. So it seemed pretty obvious that I would work with them and the park rangers and a lot of the experts, tree people with knowledge, the tree pruners, citizen pruners. I actually don't know if I did talk to Trees New York while I was developing the New York City tree alphabet, but in conversation with as many tree people as I could, I created the A to Z. So what could a New York City tree alphabet be? And it's quite, so to maybe not, I don't want to dwell on the politics too much, but for example, the letter A became an ash tree, but for a while I wasn't sure if it should be ash because, as you probably all know, we've got the emerald ash borer beetle causing a lot of damage, and ash trees, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of ash trees across the US are dead and dying, and it's devastating. And we can't plant ash. But so I was trying to come up with an alternative tree that I wasn't quite sure what to do. And so I was having these conversations with each single letter of the alphabet and their corresponding tree. What tree would work best? What are the stories and the reasons for choosing that tree? And it was Ed, and now I've forgotten Ed's name. He was at the New York, out in Staten Island. Forgive me, I'll have to blame COVID brain. The Staten Island plant organization where they were collecting seeds. It will come to me later, and some of you will probably tell me. So they have a seed bank. And so speaking with Ed, who's since retired as well, he said it's absolutely got to be ash. We can't plant it right now, but we're storing seeds for the future, and it's about hope, right? So we're hoping that at some point ash will be able to grow again. So that's a way to show the kind of reasoning behind, or that maybe the power, or maybe something that's invisible with the tree alphabet, that each of these trees has a story that you might not necessarily know if you're just a family getting your A to Z trees to teach kids or yourself how to identify trees. But it's like everything is political, right? And so what you can do with the trees, with the New York City tree alphabet was the same thing. I made the tree drawings, worked with the designer, and we made a font. So then you can type anything you want, translated into trees. So this is Denis Lebertov's. And I think this is nice because it's like we are nature. But somehow there's been this disconnect, or we've been made to forget that we are nature. And I love this quote from Mary Oliver. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? That's it. We just have this one life. Oh, so this was me with the poet Forrest Gander. These are the roots of redwood. We were in, sorry, this is an airplane. I hope you can still hear me. This was one of the last projects I did before lockdown. Well, actually, the last project. I was invited by, hope you can hear me, by Emergence magazine. A wonderful printed magazine. Well, it's not a magazine, it's a book. It's a beautiful book, but they also exist online. So if you don't know about Emergence, you should definitely check them out. I think a lot of you here tonight would love what they do. They invited myself and Forrest to work together on a project for their last issue, which ended up coming out in the spring of 2020. It was delayed, obviously, the way everything was, and came out in the summer of 2020. But we went walking in the redwoods. And here, this is interesting because I don't know if you can see on your screens, but this giant redwood, it sort of twists like it's following the rotation of the sun. And I did talk to a tree person about what this was, and they told me what they thought the term was. And of course, I can't remember now. Maybe some of you can tell me, but it's so beautiful. And if you imagine that this tree is enormous, much bigger than a building, but it's moving. You can almost see, you know how we say that we can't see trees move or plants, they move at such a slow scale. Here you can almost see how it's moving as the earth moves and the sun moves, twisting. And so we ended up creating a poem called Forest, which exists on Emergence magazine's website. Forrest Gander, the poet, he made a poem, and I translated it into a forest alphabet, starting with seeds. So this one, it moves, but I don't have it moving here. And it ends up, so I start with seeds, so each of Forrest's letters and words start as seeds, and then they grow into saplings and end up as a forest. And we ended up using this on the cover of The Language of Trees. And I feel like it's one simple drawing that kind of encapsulates how we see that we've realized now recently with work by Suzanne Simard and other scientists that trees aren't these individual separate entities like the ones here behind me, that they're not all separately fighting for resources and trying to outcompete the others. They actually live and work together like community, the way humans, or most humans do, sharing resources, communicating in a way that maybe us humans can't appreciate, but we're starting to learn how to see in the mycorrhizal network with the roots system. And so you've got this one organism system almost, rather than lots of separate individual trees. And it's kind of how I see the whole system of us humans on the planet, right? It's one planet, one little blue dot in outer space, but we're all together working to create something, hopefully something beautiful. Unfortunately, a lot of the time it doesn't feel like it's so beautiful, but I believe it is, especially when you have the tree people together. So then during lockdown, I ended up quarantined in California, of all places, and I was supposed to be in Ireland working on an Irish tree alphabet. So I ended up having to do it all remotely, the way everything happened remotely. So the Irish tree alphabet was slightly complicated because we have, I don't know if any of you know of the Ogham, which is the Irish medieval tree alphabet from around the 5th century. It's at the bottom of the screen. It's very small there. You might see it. Well, this is the animation. Let's skip through that. This is an installation view of how it ended up being. We had an exhibition in Ireland in the summer of 2020. So this is some of the Ogham. It's, if you imagine where it says today, this was the haiku or a little poem that I made myself, but that word today, for example, it's made up of the letters T-O-D-A-Y, and they are all written or stacked on top of each other from the ground up. That's how Ogham was written, from what we know. It remains now carved on stones. We presume they would have carved on trees as well, but they don't exist anymore. And so they wrote it and read it the way plants and trees grow, from the ground up, with this main trunk or stem, and then the notches coming out to show what the letter was and to communicate. So it's this really, really, really old alphabet, a human system for communicating. And it's written in a way that mirrors and mimics how plants and trees grow. And it's called an Irish tree alphabet because some of the tree names, some of the letters are named after trees from the old records that we have. And it's just something that's really beautiful, fundamental. Kind of, as an Irish person, you grow up being very aware, or at least I was very aware, that we had an Irish tree alphabet, that it's an integral part of our history. I was never taught it at school. It's very mysterious. No one can really know everything or anything really about it. We just have to conjecture a lot of what it is. So when I went to make an Irish tree alphabet, I had to incorporate that Irish tree alphabet, which we have some, like 24, I think, of our letters, plus the Irish language. I'm not a native or a fluent speaker. And so it was the English language, the Irish language, the Ogham, and then the trees. So it was quite a complex project. Anyway, I made it. There's the font exists. You can download it. You can write with Irish trees. I'm currently translating Ulysses by James Joyce into Irish trees. And so here you can see the tree drawing. So this is how each of the letters for the tree alphabet is made. Just a small piece of paper, and I make the tree silhouette as the tree would be in winter, make that drawing, I scan it, and then I add on the colors for spring. I scan it again, and summer and autumn would kind of sort of cheat and do some of the autumn at the springtime too. But all of those scans exist, and I had hoped that the font would change, that you could type and you would have winter, spring, summer, autumn. The 4 seasons would move the way you have a GIF on the computer screen. And I think the designer that I was working with, Colm over in Ireland, was interested in the idea, but it was just way too time consuming and we didn't have time to do it. But so this was 2020, and I had a little bit of time to write. So I wrote an essay for Emergence magazine again about this tree, the Irish tree alphabet, and what I was hoping it was doing. Oh, this was actually part of Ulysses translated into Irish trees. This was the tree wedding ceremony. And Nelson mentioned the wildflower alphabet. This was done in 2021. That was like the first thing I did when, first project I was able to work on when we were free to move around again. So I made packets of that had LOVE, the wildflowers from my wildflower alphabet that spelt out love. So you could literally sprinkle love through the city. And then so there were lots of actions happening throughout all of those years. You showed the image of Greta, but since 2016, I was with the election in 2016, I've been protesting, joined a lot of groups, resistance groups, took a lot of photographs, kind of felt like we were in a state of emergency. I've been campaigning for climate for many, 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 many years, as long as I can remember. But it felt with the 2016 election, it was like a whole gathering together climate with so many different issues. So many people were being attacked almost every day. Another community was under attack. And having to stand up, to tell the truth. This is the Extinction Rebellion's motto. And I feel like that's at the heart of a lot of this, is the truth. And that language was kind of being pulled apart. I didn't mention that the time when I made a book about trees and the first tree alphabet, it was 2015, right? So it was the build up to the 2016 election. This whole pretzelization of language, how words were being twisted, truth was being twisted, and it's only gotten worse since then. But that was, I think, a real, for me, it was a real reason to look at the language, the alphabet itself, like the molecules of language, and play with it a little bit, to try and, as a playful way to maybe tell a more, to show how powerful our language is, how beautiful it is. And so I just included these recent images from when I was home over the winter in Ireland. We had a huge campaign to save the Irish forests and rainforests. We've just recently started to remember that Ireland is actually the west coast of Ireland. On the Atlantic coast is Irish Atlantic rainforest. That's the natural ecosystem. So on the left is the poster for the Irish campaign, and on the right is us marching over the Brooklyn Bridge. So you can see how it's a bit more aggressive to get rid of the fascists, not the forests. And then I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. The reason I came here on my book tour is because of it felt really necessary and important. We've got this Stop Cop City movement that's happening here. Some of you, I hope, are familiar with what's going on. They it's tragic, chopping down forests, planning on chopping down the forest so they can build an industrialized cop city to train police officers how to detain, arrest, murder people. Poor Gita, who's pictured here at the bottom, was murdered in the forest at the start of the year. And it just felt like it was really important to come to Atlanta, which is a forest city, and talk about trees and community, which I think is what a lot of the book is about. I haven't actually talked a lot about what's inside of the book. That's what it looks like with the dust jacket on it. So as you can see, everything's translated into trees. Sometimes it's easy and you can follow along letter by letter. Oh, sorry, I thought I included the contents pages. So it's like 320-page book. So it's got about 50 contributors, people like, some are friends, some are family, and we together have created the book. It wouldn't be possible without all of these incredible contributors. This is the poem I made with Forrest Gander. Amitav Ghosh has contributed a wonderful, beautiful essay, and it also includes more of my drawings. Everything's printed in a dark forest green ink, and at the heart of it is the tree alphabet. And then I made the leaf alphabet, which I haven't done anything with, but it's the leaves for each of the 26 trees in the tree alphabet. And then we had the launch April 4th in the Elizabeth Street Garden. It was hosted by McNally Jackson, but we were lucky to be able to sit under their flowering pear trees right just when the buds were starting to pop. And yeah, I haven't gone into too much detail about the contents of what's in here. It's a whole collection. I guess I'm so used to doing real life events now on the book tour where people have the book in their hand and they can flick through it and see. But there's poetry, stories, essays. A lot of it is some of it is existing material that was already published and maybe older and had been forgotten about. And then there's new work that was commissioned, written especially for the book. So it's a way to, I think, talk about what's happening right now on planet Earth about trees in the language of trees, the tree alphabet. But it's hopefully a way to think about the future, right? And we can what we're doing right now is writing the future and rewriting the future. And so that's why I love the power of Trees New York and Citizen Pruners. And sorry, there are mosquitoes flying around. Oh, and I should mention now while I remember it that we can take questions. I can stop talking and we can take questions from people. But when I was in Philadelphia, they told me, I didn't know, but the equivalent group there is tree tenders. They use that word tender, to tend, which I thought was lovely. Kind of different from pruner, tree tender. But anyway, I will stop. Should I click stop share?
Yeah, that's great.
That's where I am now. My bed is actually pushed out, overhanging the cliff. So now you know where I all am. So I hope it wasn't too mysterious about what the book's actually about.
Great. Well, it was great to hear your inspiration for the book, and also great to know that as someone who's traveled extensively, that New York was a real integral part of your inspiration and your time in the Bronx. So that's great. And
thank you, Dana, Ed Toth at the Greenbelt Native Plant Center. Yes, Francesca and Marta. Exactly. in Staten Island. It's very hard with this brain. I'm often surprised that anything comes out of my mouth at all.
Great. So we're going to give everyone time to start putting their questions in the chat, and Sam will help facilitate the questions. I think there's a lot of themes that you were talking about that are related to people who love trees. I think it's a great story about the ash tree being kept in the alphabet as a sign of hope. I think trees are the ultimate symbol of hope. It's always so inspiring to go back to our projects years later to see the trees thriving and kind of naturalizing in the space and having these environmental benefits that really benefit the community, especially since they're growing in these little tiny pits and really similar resiliency as well. And also about learning outdoors is a really important part of the work that Trees New York does. And so great how you're using your art as part of education and getting students to learn outdoors. So to kick things off, just how'd you decide with the stories and the poems that you were going to translate? I'm sure there was a lot initially that you were considering. How'd you whittle it down to that you put in the book?
Oh yeah, it felt honestly like I said this when my book about trees came out, that it felt like it was the first volume of an infinite series of volumes about trees. And because everyone has a story about a tree or a favorite tree, and there's something about trees, I feel like it cracks open people's hearts. So you could be having like a terrible day, or dealing with death and all this trauma and everything. Like we've been through so many difficult years. We're still going through COVID, and yet trees, as soon as you mention it, or I say trees, people, if there's a twinkle in their eyes, you can feel their heart melt, and happy memories, good. Although as I'm saying that, then I'm thinking about all the sad stories, right, about trees that are being chopped down, etc. But there's it really does feel difficult to narrow it down. But what I did was I always start with a big piece of paper and a drawing. So I just kind of mapped out what I felt was important to talk about. It was hard to describe because I felt like it's a bit of everything. So there's the science of trees, the poetry, the activism, the deep time. With the language of trees, I was able to break it down into chapters. So we have things like tree time and tree people and forests, roots and resistance. And the story is our story, right? Humans. So there could be anything in here. Like there are recipes to make ink and food. So in a way, you could almost include anything you wanted. But it was just for me, it's like there's a sense of urgency. That's why one of the reasons I thought a book could be a way to help share this message that I feel is so important, that we're in a climate emergency. How do we deal with it? How do we make people aware? Because I was out in the streets screaming about it and I felt like nobody's listening. But I've always loved books, and I feel like there's something really powerful about books. And that's a way to share the message as a beautiful little package, right? Books are these things that you can pick up, and it like opens a whole world. It's not really answering your question about how I decided what goes in here. But yeah, and also that it's the beginning. So I hope that, because I include a bibliography, it's like 20 pages of a bibliography, and the acknowledgement section and the sources section also, and footnotes that I hope lead to other ways. So it's like there are more branches and roots, so that it's not all existing in here. It's just the beginning of the reader hopefully finding other ways to meet and learn from trees and plant trees. We had hoped, I showed the wildflower alphabet and the seed packets because we had originally hoped that we would have some tree seeds. It's really complicated, as you know, to do it. I had to explain to my editor and the publishers at Tin House that, well, it's not quite the same as wildflowers. You can't just pop them in a packet and then plant them and they pop up. So we hoped we might find a way around it. Actually, Patrick over at the same Greenbelt Native Plant Centre in Staten Island was very helpful in trying to help me do all of this. When I talked to him about hopefully getting tree seeds for the project I was doing in Staten Island, it was his idea actually to do the wildflower alphabet. He said, well, wildflowers would be much easier. So that's where the wildflower one came about. And a lot of it is like that. It's just through conversations, and you talk to somebody and then they say, well, actually, what about this? So some of the contributors to the book, it was, I said, oh, I made a tree alphabet. Would you like to use it and make something? And then we would just talk and they would say, well, what about this or that? And then I end up in this tree house in Atlanta. It was just somebody who came to my reading the other night, said, I have a tree house. Would you like to stay in it? And now you all get to see how beautiful it is.
Excellent. I'm going to pass it over to Sam to ask the next question here.
So, Katie, we do have a question from the chat, and that is, will you be doing any more work in New York City?
Hopefully. Yeah, well, related to the book, we're hoping to have more events. The book comes out in Ireland and the UK in June, so I'll be over there June, July, part of August, and then we're hoping to have events in New York in September. So that'll be specifically around the book. And it's still trying to figure those out, so I can't say anything right now. I don't know if Buffalo counts as New York. When people say New York, do they mean the city? But Buffalo, New York, I'll be up there actually for the last event before I go over to Ireland. And that's Friday, May 19th. I'll be in Buffalo. It'll be my first time visiting. I'm very excited. So I'll be in conversation with Patty Crawlock, a local writer up there who just wrote a beautiful book called Becoming Kin. And then I'm going to spend the weekend at the art park just outside Buffalo in Lewiston. And we'll have tree workshops. We'll do some screen printing with the Book Art Centre up there. And Patty will join me again. And we'll have some walks and breathing. I'm big into breathing. The trees breathe out and we breathe in. So that, I think, should be a lovely way to end. But yeah, then New York City, there will always be projects. I just, right now, this book is all consuming. And also with my health, it's very difficult to cope with more projects. So I have to kind of press the pause button and try and slow down, which was, I don't know if I mentioned, but the reason for making the tree alphabet was to try and slow down, enter tree time. It was something I was consciously trying to do it myself and hopefully other people. I think everything's moving too quickly. COVID obviously slowed things down, but then it's all sped up and it's going even faster now. And so now having this form of long COVID that I have, where I'm forced to slow down, like I literally can't move the way I did. So it's like I'm entering tree time.
And another question here. You mentioned that the alphabet for New York City trees began with ash. Is the tree alphabet in this book A for apple, related to a specific place?
No, so the alphabet that's in the book, because I made it for the book about trees, which happened very quickly. I had the idea at 2 o'clock in the morning when I was sort of falling asleep. That's when you have all the best ideas. I hopped out of bed, sketched out the idea, sent it off to my brother, who's a writer and had a publishing house, and we wanted to work on a book together. And I said, I have this idea for the tree alphabet. And he replied immediately the next morning. He was in Berlin and he said, great idea, brilliant book, let's make it. And 6 months later, we had the printed book because I said it has to be ready for September. I didn't mention my birthday and celebrating my 40th or anything. So we made the entire book from when I had the concept to having it printed in 6 months, which is really, really crazy for book publishing. Things don't usually happen that quickly. So I had to make so as soon as we said, yes, we're going to do it, then that meant the designers in Berlin needed the tree font. They said, okay, if you're asking us to design this book in trees, we need the tree font now. So I had to sit down again with a piece of paper and pen, and I wrote A to Z, so all the letters of the alphabet on the left-hand side of the page. And then I just jotted down whatever trees. And I thought, oh, maybe if I just use the first letter of the tree's name for that letter of the alphabet, maybe that's a simple way to do it. And that's how it came into being. It was kind of like an emergency situation. And so a lot of those trees actually do overlap with the trees in the Irish and the New York alphabet, because they're trees that I know, they're trees that I grew up with, and the New York Irish planting palette is not so, like, obviously they're not all the same trees, but there is a lot of overlap with oak and ash. But yeah, it happened very quickly.
Sounds like it. And one other question here, and I was wondering about this too. For the 3D tree that you showed, that was the installation, what recycled materials did you use?
Oh, yeah, so that was in the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis. Not to go into the long version of the story, but it kind of related to the wildflower seed alphabet that I just made recently. But this project was way back in 2007. I had been invited by the curator at the museum to do a public artwork outside of the museum in the city, in the city, what do you call it, center, but it was full of vacant lots. And there was a vacant lot across from the museum. And I was going to do a wildflower meadow because that's what would have been there before the city of St. Louis was built. Worked with the local native plant collector people. Of course, definitely can't remember their names. And over a year, we've been developing this project. How we got permission from the landowner, who was the Pulitzer building was next door to our museum. And so we had everything was going to plan. It was all fabulous. We had these seeds, we were going to plant it up. But when the digger came in to do the preparation of the land before we planted the seeds, the guy who had the key, so he doesn't own it, he's just a man with a key, he said no, and he wouldn't let the gates, he wouldn't open the gates. We couldn't do the project. He said it's dangerous, you can't have long grass and weeds, people will be mugged and horrible things will happen. It's not right. So this whole fear and scare, the reason I mentioned all of this before telling you about the tree is it feeds into this whole, actually one of the people in the book is Fritz Haig, he writes about Salmon Creek Farm, his project that's in, beautiful project that's in California in the Redwoods. But before that, he did a project called Edible Estates, where he invited people to remove their front lawns, because the lawns, I mentioned leaf blowers earlier, we've got this battle on our hands, right, against lawns and pesticides, fossil fuel industry. So Fritz was inviting people to remove their front lawns and plant with edibles. And there's a lot of resistance because people are scared of what looks like weeds. It looks untended, back to that word tender. Anyway, so St. Louis, we were told, no, we can't plant the prairie after all. And so I had to move inside the museum, or something else happened with the exhibition inside. So I was offered the whole inside of the museum. And I thought, okay, this is an emergency situation. Again, what am I going to do? It's a huge, enormous building. And I don't really make sculptural or object things. So I just said, can you keep, I had made one or two smaller trees, like the scale of my own body almost. And they kept wood. So to actually finally, in a long-winded way, answer the question, it was bits of wood and lots of cardboard and newspaper. Because I have always been recycling and using papier-mâché and old newspapers. I've made a lot of works using old news. And then we did have bits of plastic, and all of this was taped together with black duct tape. And it was back in 2007. So I think it was the Bush presidency, and there was a lot of oil digging and derricks and spills and things happening. So the tree to me kind of looked like this. It was this strange black tree. Yeah. Anyway, it was very big and complicated, and I couldn't have done it without the staff, the tech crew there at the museum, their support to make something on such a large scale.
When I saw it, it reminded me very much of, I think it's the John Innes Center in England. They do work on apple trees and rootstocks, and they had an apple tree and root system that they basically washed out of the ground in one complete piece, and it's now mounted in their display center as a display of some of their work. So I saw it, and I instantly thought, wait, did she actually go get a whole tree?
I've used that image. I'm pretty sure it's the same image on the cover of another book that I made years ago. It was actually for I was trying to think, what was that book? It was the book that accompanied my exhibition there at the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis. And I called that exhibition Paths of Desire. And I got contacted that research place in the UK, and one of the scientists kindly went through the archives. I guess he was curious as well, and he found the negatives of a photograph of that. It was a Cox's pippin apple tree, and he sent the scans to me, so I was able to make prints. I made prints of the photograph of that tree. People still don't believe me. That's amazing that you know about it. It's incredible that they excavated all of the roots. But so I was always interested in the invisible things that you can't see. And when I worked on the tree museum project, it came up again and again, where kids and even adults weren't really realizing that the trees were alive. They would see them as city infrastructure, like you have the posts, lampposts, fencing around parks, cars, all of that stuff, buildings, and then a tree. And they were like, yeah, the trees are in the way, just like chop them down so we can shout at each other see each other out the window, or that we can play football. And talking to them, I realized it was like when I said that if the haiku hikes, I could see the kids' brains twisting around. That was happening to me through these conversations. I was realizing that my brain, my understanding of the world was having to change to see how other people who grew up in the city, because this was all foreign. I know what a tree is and that it's alive, and it starts as this tiny seed and it grows down and up and it has roots and all of this. And then I was meeting people who had no idea. They just had no experience, no way of knowing. And so to talk about these invisible parts, with the Tree Museum, we did a lot of chalk drawing as well. So it was to talk about, under this tarmac and underneath the ground, there are roots and there are worms and there's this whole world, and there's water and there's underground rivers. And so the invisible parts of things, I think, are important, which is also about communication, right? There's like all these birds and insects that are communicating, but on an invisible frequency for us because we can't tap into it.
And I think we have one last question here, and that was, can you talk more about your concept of tree time?
Yeah, I think, in a simple way of thinking about it is that, I grew up being told the pretty standard, I guess, European way of thinking about tree time, or sorry, not tree time, of time is linear. So you have past, present, future. And in reality, I think everything's kind of looped around. So this movie that just came out, Everything Everywhere All at Once, sort of plays with this. And I think it's becoming more part of our consciousness, because you have the multiverse and people thinking about the scientists who are talking about the pluriverse, and that all of these parallel universes are all happening at the same time. So that's obviously very complicated science, and I don't know experts. I don't know about all of this, but in a more bringing it down to earth way, you have indigenous communities who talk in a different way about time than we do. So they will say that the future is actually at our back. So we're looking at the past. And then you have with the Tree Museum, I was interested in thinking about sharing stories today, like in that very particular moment, that about things that happened then. One of the stories was about a tree stump. So the tree itself was gone. It was just the stump that was left. And Jonathan Pywell, who was the forester at the time, he told the story about, well, we can see that there are 200 rings, and the rings, we all know tree rings go round in circles. There were 200 plus of them. So that meant that tree had been standing there for 200 years. So it had seen all of these things that had happened. And what's happening in the future is part of what's happening right now. So we are literally writing the future. So that's why it's so important that you have the activists here in Atlanta who are trying to stop 300 acres of forest being chopped down so that cops can move in, or why East River Park needs to be protected, even though the city's going to go ahead anyway. But, to bear witness for this is so important. I'm not really answering the tree time, but I think this slow, deep time that trees give us access to, that we are not living in this minute by minute, like Instagram click. I don't use TikTok, but everything happens so quickly. It's much more circular. It's something that we explored again in other projects that I did with Emergence magazine with Chelsea Steinauer Scudder, who's also in this book. She writes about tree migration in the book, where we looked at one pin oak, and you spiral in and out. And I used the actual universe. So I went from the seed of an oak tree and how it mirrors again the patterns. The entire universe as we know it is the same shape. And we think everything began right at this moment before time even existed, and then it exploded out. And now we're rushing towards where it's shrinking back in. And so definitely a straight line doesn't make any sense, that you have ABC. It's like flat earth thinking, maybe. I'm just making this up. I've never heard. Could be a good idea to think that thinking of time in a linear way is like flat earth thinking, and that we need to move beyond that. I mentioned the indigenous have ways of, or there are different ways of thinking about time, because I haven't mentioned rights of nature, but that's a big part of the book, was trying to, I believe campaigning for the rights of nature. We realize that we are nature. So if we campaign to save trees and forests and ecosystems and rivers and water, and write that into our constitution, it's a way to protect ourselves, humans, right? Because we're all connected and part of this. And I think with time, that's part of it all. It's just we've become so disconnected, and it's the indigenous communities who are showing us that, because they are leading the way with the rights of nature. They've already been successful in many places, like Ecuador, writing it into the constitution, especially for bodies of water. For some reason, I mentioned this in here, it's been talked to a lawyer who's worked campaigning on it, that it's been more complicated to do rights of nature for trees. Somehow that seems more complicated than a body of water. But soon, I think it's going to happen.
Thank you so much, Katie, for spending Arbor Day with all of us and telling us more about your book. For everyone on, we are going to raffle off a copy of the book. So hopefully in the next few days, we'll be letting you know if you won that raffle, a signed copy by the author. And so we look forward to sending that out to you. And just to close off, Katie, can you tell us how people can find out more about your work, plug your website, your social media, so people can learn more, and where they can buy the book?
Oh, I don't know if anybody needs more plugs for anything, do they? It's just my name, katieholten.com. I have a website where I try to share up-to-date info on the book tour and everything. And then I use Twitter, just Katie Holten, and Instagram at Katie Holten to try and share. And you can always reach me. My email is the same. It's just katieholten@gmail.com. And it's like a necessary evil, I guess, all this social media. I hate it, especially with my condition. Everything's exhausting. But it's also been a lovely way to connect. People have turned up at events, like David Haskell, you probably know David, who's written a lot of books about trees, turned up at my event here in Atlanta. Last time I was talking to him, he was living in Boulder or in Colorado. So I had no idea he was here, but through social media, he was able to turn up, and that's happened in different cities. So I guess it's useful.
Everything has its uses and dangers. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And we'll be sending out the replay in a few days. And don't forget to check out our website as well, Trees New York. If you're looking to get involved and volunteer, we have an events page there that will be listing new events. We just closed out April that we had a lot of events, and we're going to start posting all of our May events. So we hope to see everyone in person, not just over Zoom, planting trees and caring for trees. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nelson and Sam, and everyone. Take care.